This first session is an introduction to bilingual education, and we're going to be starting having having some discussions at your table, and I would welcome you at any point to actually ask any questions you would like to ask, to interrupt. So first, perhaps just a couple of words about my background, why I presume to speak about bilingual education. That is Estonia. I'm Estonian. That is perhaps a little bit difficult to believe when you hear me speak English, but that will be explained shortly. Estonia is a pretty empty country, 1.3 million people. It's about the size of a little bigger than Holland, a little bigger than Belgium. But in the last 5 years, I've been living in England, and I've had a chance to research the management and pedagogical implications of bilingual programming, working through the University of London. And here are the reasons, those two symbols are the reasons why I speak English the way I do, because I learned to speak English at age 5, growing up in Canada. Canada also has quite a few bilingual programs that I've been involved with while I was there, immersion programs in particular, which I'll be speaking about later on. America, I've had a chance to spend 7 years living in America. I find it a very unusual place in some ways when it comes to bilingual education. There is the state of Utah, which is going gung-ho on bilingual education, developing tremendous, powerful bilingual programs. And there are other places, such as the state of California, which are restricting access to bilingual education. And why? Because it seems to be counterintuitive. People have trouble believing the research. They just don't seem to want to look at it. Had some experience in Asia, been able to work with schools from 7 countries who come together in Malaysia for several weeks. Had an opportunity to work in Paris. Does anyone recognize that tower? Yes. Are you Kazakh? Ah, Kyrgyz. This is the Bayturek Tower in Astana in Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan is establishing a trilingual network of schools called the Nazarbayev Intellectual Schools, and are going about this in perhaps the most systematic manner that any education system has ever done it. It's a very special set of circumstances because there are 20 schools and they're being purpose-built and they're exceptionally well-resourced. But nonetheless, they're going about it in a very systematic way, working with Cambridge, working with international organizations to help them get the program off the ground. And I've been involved in that program as well. And I've also worked for the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Estonian Ministry of Education. Whenever one is going to begin to discuss anything or work on any program, it's important to at least begin to agree on terms. And even a term such as bilingualism is a highly contentious term. People understand it in very different ways. So I would ask for a show of hands, who in this room is bilingual? Okay, who is monolingual? Okay, now, who is trilingual? Okay, now one person, quadrilingual? Ah, and it'd be interesting to see how far we could go up. In fact, these terms are very difficult to determine. And if you understood the question, and English isn't your first language, you're clearly on some level bilingual. So let's try and look at some of the terminology around this. You have a sheet in your folder with some definitions of bilingualism. At least I was under the impression you do? Yes. You do, excellent. Definitions of bilingualism? All right. Could I ask you in your group to simply have a look at some of those first definitions? Or have a look at all of those definitions except for the last two, the bilingual student and bilingual education. And can you discuss in your group what you think about these definitions? Do you like the definitions? Do you see them as problematic in any way? So could you just take 2-3 minutes to read through them and to discuss those definitions? And how is each definition different from the other? So how are these definitions different from one another? Which definition do you like? Which ones don't you like and why? So what did you come up with? What about that first definition? The native-like control of 2 or more languages. Does this seem like a reasonable definition?
Thank you. I think for 1935 it was a good definition, but for where we're at today it was just a little bit vague. It didn't give us enough information.
Okay, anyone else? This gentleman, our Kyrgyz colleague.
The other languages, we don't have to know like native like. You know, if we can communicate in that language, if we can understand each other, it is enough. I mean, we should improve, but we don't have to know like native like.
Right. Anyone else like to make a comment about that first definition? All right. Well, in fact, it's very hard to actually define what native-like control is, because if we think of the range of people that we've met in our lives who speak what is for us our first and strongest, most dominant language, then there's a wide range, actually, in people use that language. For instance, an academic will speak English at Oxford in a completely different way, for instance, from someone who may be serving you in a restaurant. May not, but likely will. So there's a wide range in the way people speak any language, and no one has ever actually come up with a good way of saying this is the absolute standard. I mean, there is the Oxford English Dictionary, etc., but there is no really strong standard of saying what native-like control is. And I think our Kyrgyz colleague made a very important point, that the bottom line is that people communicate, and if you communicate effectively, that is, you're bilingual. You're able to get your message across, you're able to understand someone else. So in fact, unfortunately, Bloomfield's definition, it's an old one, but there's still a lot of people who sort of expect this. And there is one unfortunate thing. Sometimes, in some circumstances, the marketplace will demand from some people, in a very small number of professions, a very high degree of bilingualism. What about this one, the McNamara one? Anything that bothers you about that definition? It's a very low level, and consequently, this gentleman himself wouldn't consider himself a bilingual, and there are other people who might not consider you a bilingual. So it's a very generous definition. It works on some level. Very few people are monolingual anymore, in a sense. Even in English-speaking societies, in countries where we know that there isn't a large, the percentage of people who speak foreign languages is relatively small in comparison with other countries, even those people have picked up some phrases. So there's some level of bilingualism, but it's not really enough to do a great deal with. What about this one? Ortiz et al. Anything that's been added to this definition? Perhaps the key thing here is that they've added the word effectively. So what is important there is that communication is taking place. People are able to do what they need to do with the language, but it's not important whether they're making any grammatical errors. The reason they're neurologists, they look at the brain. They also wanted to have a sweeping definition to cover all age ranges, so that's why they've added that in there. And they've added in the concept of context, so I have to be able to communicate effectively in a given context, in a given situation. What about this definition from the Council of Europe? These are bits and pieces pulled out from a more eloquently written definition. What has been added to this? What are the new elements? I heard it. A social agent, intercultural action. So here the expectation is that bilingualism isn't just a matter of language, it's also a matter of culture. It's a matter of not simply learning the language and then sitting in my room reading books, but it's saying that I actually engage in interaction, intercultural interaction. So their concept of plurilingualism or bilingualism, in this case 3 or more languages, includes this extra element of intercultural communication, implying that language is much more than simply a set of symbols and words that we use. So perhaps the one that I'm using at the moment as a simple one is that bilinguals are individuals and groups of people who effectively use 2 or more languages for intercultural communication in various contexts. Can we work with that? Would anyone like to protest? How have you benefited from bilingualism? Take a few moments to talk about that at your table, and then we'll pass the mic around and hear about that. I get the sense that either you've met up with people that you haven't seen in a long time, or that there are an awful lot of benefits to bilingual education, based on at least that exchange. What are some of them that you've come up with?
Okay, so my group came up with they obviously understand that when we have a command of another language, maybe 2 or 3 languages, we have an access to more knowledge and experience another culture. But in addition to that, my team here also say that in education, we're able to pick up some knowledge on another culture point in order to bring in education to teach our students about that.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I think that being a bilingual is just open a door or window to the world, and especially in China, because Chinese is very different from English. So which means that if Chinese people want to go abroad, want to actively involved in the world fair, the language, I think, is the first tool to get you there. And also, like I'm going to talk about this afternoon, it's offering the Cambridge course to Chinese students. I think it's very popular in China now, and more parents see the benefit of being bilingual, and more students get benefit from the international education as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Carrie?
Just to add to that a little bit, because some of us have learned different languages. English is my first language, and when I was living in Egypt, I started to study Arabic fluently, and it opened up new understandings of the cultures. It enhanced relationships, and we really were able to share knowledge and understanding. So I think it's bilingualism is good all the way around.
Someone?
Yeah. In our school, some teachers are worried about the examination result. If we teach chemistry or physics in English, the students can understand well if we teach them in Chinese. So that is also our worries, whether we should teach them in English or teach them in Chinese.
Okay.
So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
In fact, there are lots of people who are kind of worried about bilingualism. In Estonia, because Estonia has a neighbor that has been somewhat aggressive, and so there was some concern in particular about Estonian and Russian. And Estonians worked very hard to preserve their language, and of course Russians have worked to preserve theirs. And people were afraid that bilingualism might actually diminish one language or the other language. And I think some people saw that there's a situation where there's only so much space in the brain. But in fact, we're capable of learning a large number of languages and learning them quite well. And students are actually capable of learning through several languages. We'll come and look at the educational programs and some of their outcomes as long as the education is of good quality. So quality bilingual education in the long term delivers results. And there's no reason to assume that if students are being taught through their mother tongue, that they are listening, or that they're paying attention, or that they're understanding everything that's being said. Their minds are going to be wandering off. There's a fair amount of educational research that is also telling us that bilingual education in some ways helps children to concentrate because they have to work harder. They have to work harder at getting it. They have to work harder at being careful about detail. But we'll come to that later. Allow me to go through some of the benefits of bilingualism. Here are a few. Thank you. First, let me go through some of the cognitive benefits of bilingualism, how it helps us to think. And I'm going to suggest to Ben that an academic paper I wrote on this be placed on the website or wherever you decide. You'll explain. The Cambridge Assessment Singapore website, which will have all of the academic references to this. But because we're racing through much of the material, I'm not going to go into tremendous detail. So I hope you'll take these statements at face value, but there'll be an academic paper that you can go to for the sources. One of the pieces is that it's thought that bilinguals have a kind of a problem-solving mind. They have enhanced control over their thought processes. It's what's called executive control. They can better ignore distracting and irrelevant stimuli. So in test results, when bilingual students are put in situations where they're supposed to do a task, and the researchers bombard them with or give them some irrelevant information, the bilinguals are better able to ignore it. And the bilinguals are better able to focus in on the task. So they're used to probably processing, because as you're learning a language, you're processing things you don't completely understand yet. You're used to a little bit of confusion. And they can stay better focused. So says the research. The flexible mind. Actually, the mind is, people like Carol Dweck and Deutsch would say that the mind is more like a muscle. It's a physical organ after all, and we can reshape our minds. One neuron can connect with up to 10,000 other neurons, and as we learn, our neural networks become more extensive, and they become more robust for bilinguals. It's also thought that bilinguals can look at the world from different perspectives, so they have more avenues of thought. And so we're not just talking about two separate monolingual sort of minds working together, but it's one mind, in a sense, where the two languages are intertwined and supporting each other. It's a kind of what Vivian Cook calls multi-competence. It's also the interpersonal mind. Bilingualism seems to help build people's sensitivity to context. Once again, it's the same issue as with flexibility. People who are bilingual, at least in many of the research studies, tend to view the world from different perspectives. Also, for instance, when bilinguals are given images, shown images, where many images are embedded within one image, bilinguals are able to find more of those images. So they're able to look at the world from different perspectives, different angles. Gives one a slight edge. And it seems to be able to nurture or foster intercultural communication. The metalinguistic mind. Now, awareness of language, having metalinguistic awareness is being able to step back and look at the language, analyze the language. It's awareness of language as a tool for thinking and communication. And it's thought that the bilinguals are better able to do that, to step back from language for a moment, to look at it, to analyze it. Greater understanding of how language is used to achieve its goals. This has quite a few implications. For instance, in the Val d'Ost region in Italy, children are going through a trilingual program. And it is found that when they're given mathematics tasks through the medium of a second language, that they're actually performing very well on the highly demanding cognitive questions. And that when those highly demanding cognitive questions are posed in the first language, then people just assume immediately that they've understood and get on with it. And whereas if they're functioning in their second language, they're having to concentrate harder on them. So in a sense, it gives one, if you're aware of language, you're aware of ambiguity, you're aware of the fact that words may have several meanings, you're more likely to take a moment to think about what that word really meant. So a greater understanding of how language is used to achieve specific goals. And the learning mind would be another one. It's thought the bilinguals have improved episodic memory. That's the what, when, and where. That they have improved semantic memory, the how. And that because memory is so important to learning in general, I mean, it's central to the learning process, that means that the bilingual may have an advantage in learning in general. And has anyone heard about the health benefits of bilingualism? The cognitive health, they're really cognitive benefits, but they have health implications. Bilingualistic at York University in Toronto and others have looked at the effects of aging, in particular, what happens when people get dementia and what happens when one is bilingual versus what happens when one is monolingual. And she's found that you get an extra 3.9 years of additional mental acuity, mental sharpness, if you're a bilingual. And what's particularly important is that they controlled for a large number of things. They controlled for things such as education. They controlled for gender, the different types of languages. And across each of these groups, you get an extra 4 years. So if you're bilingual and you have a high school education, you're still going to get an extra 4 years. If you're university educated, compared to a university educated person, you should get an extra 4 years. And that doesn't mean that the disease wouldn't be present in your brain. The pathology would still be there. But because your neural networks are probably, in a bilingual, more robust, not unlike a national power grid, if you have a problem in a power grid, an outage, a power outage in some area, if you have a very complex grid, then you can bypass that problem in the grid and bring power to the community through other routes. So it's thought that the bilingual is able to, simply because of their more robust neural network, bypass that pathology to some extent and compensate for it. So improved executive function, control over thinking, and memory may slow down the rate of decline. So there are quite a few benefits to, and we're not going to go into the financial benefits here today. The financial benefits for countries, because countries that share a language have increased trade flows. We know that companies that have a good language policy or thought through what they're doing with language tend to export more. If you export more, you get intelligence from other markets, etc. The benefits, the list of benefits is very, very long. And at the same time, there are a lot of myths out there about bilingualism. There's some concerns about what it might do. Are there any myths that you want to raise, or any concerns? Anything that... Perhaps myths isn't the right word, because if it's a concern, it's a concern. Are there any concerns you have with bilingualism that you'd want to raise? No, well, one was raised. We'll come back to it later on. So let's go on with the definitions. Who's a bilingual student? It's someone who can meet curriculum expectations in those subjects taught primarily either through the first language or primarily through the second language. So that is how you judge. Are they coping? Are they able to do their schoolwork. If they are, in that environment, in those circumstances, they're bilingual. Now, if you pull a child out of a bilingual program in grade 5 in the 5th year of school, if they're functioning very, very well, that does not mean that that child will be able to use that language at a very high level 20 years later. One of the unfortunate things about language is we have to keep working on it. We have to keep working on it all of our lives. Language is dynamic. I think it is either going up or it's going down. I don't think there's a lot of staying in one place. We're either all the time learning or the other one's in decline. And I've got 3 strong languages, and I would say that 2 are particularly strong, Estonian and English, and perhaps only when it comes to academic writing, because I write more and more in English, I now have to struggle with the academic writing in Estonian. But that's a natural part of the process. And I'd much rather be trilingual and have that struggle than be monolingual and not have that struggle. So a bilingual student is able to cope, and this includes biliteracy, the ability to read and write in 2 or more languages. I'd like to raise a couple of other terms because I think they're important. One is additive versus subtractive bilingualism. There are programs that are called bilingual by some people that don't have the goal of developing additive bilingualism. They have the goal of, in fact, having a child learn a society's dominant language and showing very little concern for the child's first language. And those could be called subtractive because the dominant society's dominant language will become that child's dominant language, and the home language or the language of the community, that particular small community, might go into decline. So that would be called subtractive bilingualism. Most people working in the field are pro-additive bilingualism and work hard against subtractive bilingualism. But there are plenty of people in the world putting the label bilingual education on subtractive programs. And an example would simply be some countries that will remain unnamed at the moment that will provide, let's say, 3 years of mother tongue education with the goal of then transitioning children to starting to use the society's dominant language. With, in a sense, a goal of providing some support in the beginning, but not showing a great deal of concern about that language later on. So if we sum up bilingual education, it supports an individual in becoming and remaining bilingual. So we're talking about additive bilingualism. At least 2 languages are used to teach different subjects, content subjects, such as mathematics. And I would add that this is also done in the ideal during the final years of schooling. Because if you're only using the 2 languages in the first few years, then by the time a child gets close to the end of their schooling, well, there's a whole group of registers that that child will not be developing in the other language. So quality ethical bilingual education, what is it not? Well, it's definitely not just for high achievers. We have plenty of research coming out of several continents. In particular, these programs were developed very thoroughly in Canada and the United States, and they've been most intensively researched. But there are bilingual programs in many countries, from Australia to many European countries. In Estonia, we've also established a bilingual program in Russian language schools for the Russian language community, which is a voluntary program, and that is been researched very thoroughly, and the Russian children are learning to speak Estonian, they're meeting curriculum expectations, and they're achieving well in Russian reading and writing tests, and the average student is coping. And we know from these studies that the student who tends to get a C functions perfectly well in bilingual programs. They may still continue to get a C, but at least they're bilingual. So ideally, quality bilingual education is not just for the elite, because the elite does quite well usually in life. It seems that a quality bilingual program could really offer some good, solid power to provide a path to improving the lives of people who don't belong to the elite, shall we say. And as said before, it's definitely not for suppressing the first language. And another mantra would be that it's not simply changing the language of instruction. So it would not simply be my starting to give this talk in Estonian and saying, good luck, sink or swim. It would mean providing lots of support, lots of visuals perhaps in the beginning, providing lots of organized phrases, etc., that students can use. But can you take a look in your folder now at this diagram that is called the many faces of CLIL? Now, CLIL is a term we'll talk about in a moment. It's content and language integrated learning. And some people see it as an umbrella term that covers many types of programs. Now, here is a series of programs. Can you take a look at those? And in your group, discuss those, and then to just find out whether there are some that you're not sure what they mean, to see if someone else in your group can tell you, and then I'll talk about those that any group would like to hear more about. So look through them, see if in the group you can determine what they mean, and then I'll answer any questions you have.